One. Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch for our continued coverage of the Alex Ewing trial. Ewing charged with the gruesome murders, the gruesome 1984 murders of Deborah and Bruce Bennett and their 7-year-old daughter, Melissa. This has been a trial that started earlier on this week, and every day we are joined by 9 Wants to Know investigative reporter Kevin Vaughn, along with the 9 News director of reporting, Nicole Vapp, both whom will be joining us for continued coverage of this trial. Kevin is at the courthouse every day, so Kevin, I'm going to start with you. What we saw at the courthouse earlier on today, I know that there was some compelling parts, especially relating to the DNA evidence today, Kevin.
That's what we're into now. We're into the forensic evidence. This is a DNA case. There are no fingerprints. There's not an eyewitness. There's not camera footage capturing the killer. This is a DNA case. So lots of testimony today about the collection, preservation, storage, and testing of evidence, forensic serology evidence, in other words, bodily fluid, biological evidence like blood and semen and saliva, things like that.
And Kevin, maybe go back to the beginning when they first announced they had a suspect. This went back to genealogical DNA. And maybe explain a little bit why this DNA that they're talking about in this part of the trial is so important.
Well, as you know, these cases were unsolved for more than 35 years, and so, but the one piece of compelling evidence that they had in both the murders of the Bennett family and this murder a week earlier out in Lakewood of a woman named Patricia Smith was they had DNA left at both of those scenes that matched each other. And so since the early 2000s, they had this genetic profile, and they didn't know who it belonged to. And then in 2018, the Nevada Department of Corrections started testing inmates in his prison system for DNA and uploading them into the national database. And lo and behold, they did that. And Alex Ewing, the man on trial for the Bennett murders, his DNA was matched to the DNA found at the Bennett crime scene. In particular, DNA found on carpeting beneath 7-year-old Melissa Bennett's body. She was sexually assaulted, and on a comforter that was partially covering her body when it was discovered. So DNA in 2 locations from semen in the Bennett home. That's what this case is about, right there.
And you've been talking a little bit with me about the difference in the policing between Lakewood and Aurora. And, when you hear that they have DNA in a case, you think, boom, done, print it, we're over. But because of the way the policing was happening back in 1984, there's a little room. They have a little wiggle room in the defense.
Sure. A number of Aurora police officers testified that, for example, that they did not wear gloves when they collected evidence in 1984. Something that the Lakewood officers investigating the other case, also tied to Alex Ewing by DNA, were doing. There is evidence that has gone missing over the 35 years. There are some microscopic slides, for example, nobody knows where they are. There is some evidence that was destroyed in the testing process. There was a hair, for example, found on Melissa Bennett's body that they, at the time, thought was the killer's hair. It was tested in the 1980s before you could really get DNA from hair, and it was destroyed in that testing process. So it doesn't exist now for testing purposes. And so, the prosecution is basically saying there's no innocent explanation for Alex Ewing's DNA to be around the body of a 7-year-old murder and rape victim. And the defense's job is to say there's reason to suspect that DNA evidence might be tainted, that it might have somehow gotten contaminated in the lab. They have not offered an explanation for that, how that could have happened, but they have raised a lot of questions about police work that, looking back from the perspective of today, we would say was not as good as it could have been.
But do they need to offer a plausible other? They just have to say that it could be tainted, and if the jury believes them.
Here's the problem, though. They have to offer. This is what I think. they have to offer some way it could have been tainted. And one of the things that the jury has been told is that Alex Ewing has not been in Colorado since 11 days after the Bennett murders. That 11 days after the Bennett murders, he would left Colorado and he was not returned until he was brought here last year to stand trial in these two cases, and that he had no access to any genetic testing labs and no access to anywhere where the evidence was stored. So the jury has been told this. It's what they call a stipulation. Basically, the prosecution wanted to tell the jury that he's been in prison in Nevada all these years. That's how they know where he was. The judge ruled that was too prejudicial to him. So he told the two sides to come up with a language they could accept. And so the judge has read this to the jury a couple of times, that both sides agree he was not in Colorado for, almost all of the time since the murders, and that he had no access to the evidence or any place where the evidence was tested. So the question becomes, can there be some other scenario where his DNA is on these pieces of evidence? One thing that's interesting is the evidence in the Aurora case and the evidence in the Lakewood case, a lot of it was tested at CBI. And so the defense has been asking questions about whether there could have been cross-contamination there. But the prosecution did a really good job today on one point, which is the evidence from the Bennett case that's got DNA on it was at the CBI lab for testing and was returned to Aurora on, I think, February 24th, 1984. And the evidence in the Lakewood place didn't get to the CBI lab until 4 days after that. So that the two pieces of evidence in the two cases were not in the lab at the same time. I would think that is something that, would argue against the idea that they somehow contaminated each other.
And you said yesterday that they were really questioning whether or not the woman in Lakewood knew him. How
Right.
long was he in Colorado at that time? And, where was he? What was he doing here?
Here's what we know. There was a witness yesterday who testified that they worked at the same plumbing company in the spring and summer of 1983 and actually lived together for a while in a mobile home out off East Colfax, east of I-225. We know that in July of 1983, Alex Ewing got a Colorado driver's license. And we know that when he was arrested in Arizona 11 days after the Bennett murders, he told the police there that he had just come from Colorado and gave them a Denver address. So we know he was in Colorado for a portion of 1983 and early 1984. And that's about the extent of it. As we've reported in the past, he bounced around a lot in the years before that. He has a criminal history in California. He's got one in Arizona. He's got one in Florida. He moved around a lot, working sort of menial type jobs. At one point in Arizona, he was working as like a cook in a fast food restaurant. He was working on a sewer crew at this plumbing company. So that's what we know about him. We know that they've established he was here in 1983 from a roommate and from him getting his driver's license. And, according to the court records in Arizona, when he was arrested 11 days after the Bennett murders, he told them he had just come from Colorado.
So anything else today? Any other evidence? Pretty much just DNA?
Honestly, it was tedious and time consuming. And I'm wondering if the jury is following a lot. There was a lot of discussion about all the different kinds of enzymes and so forth in blood. They were trying to establish, who did the blood stain on this one wall come from? She was explaining why it had to be Bruce Bennett's blood stain and not somebody else's in the family, with, all the different markers in blood. Pre-DNA, this is pre-DNA testing done back in 1984. So there was a lot of that.
But you've said before to me that some of these things, it's not like it is on TV. You're not
right
on TV. You're not seeing all the setup to the big gotcha moment. So This is all important stuff to be getting out there piece by piece by piece.
Yeah, they're educating the jury on how this works. And the last witness today was a highly experienced, serologist at CBI who's been there for decades and quite a presence on the witness stand. And she was going through all of her testing of the evidence in 1999, and they said today they're going to bring her back later on. And I think the later on will be, what did you find in that testing? And she's going to say, I found this DNA here and this DNA here and this DNA here, and it matched this person. That's my guess. But I think we'll see that early next week. The prosecution indicated today they could wrap as early as, at the end of the day, Tuesday. I'm pretty fast. 4 days of testimony. I believe 19 witnesses so far. And the prosecution is basically saying they need a couple more days. So I think it's gonna be done quicker than the 3 weeks that they've set aside for this.
Interesting. Anything else next week that we should be looking forward to?
I mean, the defense is going to put on their case. They said they're going to take at least a couple of days. So they have hinted at the fact that the police don't have Alex Ewing's fingerprints in this crime scene, and I think the prosecution said today they're not going to dispute that they don't have the fingerprints. It'll be interesting to see what other evidence they bring up. They hinted today that they were going to raise the possibility that other suspects might be out there that weren't looked carefully at, and that they also might raise issues about other things police did not do, evidence that's never been tested, that kind of thing. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, does the jury believe that DNA evidence is legitimate? And if it does, it's hard to see a scenario where they could explain that away.
So there's probably not really a chance that he would testify.
I would be shocked if he would testify, to be honest with you. I just don't see it. But you never know. It's his choice.
True.
Well, I suppose we'll find out. I was going to say, I suppose we will find out next week, and we certainly appreciate a few minutes of both your times there, Kevin and Nicole. And by the way, just to also recap as well, if you're unfamiliar with some details about the case or you want to learn a bit more about it, well, we've got plenty of resources for you. We do have the 11-part podcast, Blame, The Fear All These Years, that is on Apple Podcasts as well as on 9news.com/blame. And you can also text BLAME, BLAME, to 303-871-1491 for continued updates on this case as well. So, Nicole, Kevin, we appreciate a few minutes of your time here, and we look forward to catching up with you